Everyone, thank you for coming. We are just waiting because there are so many people that are arriving. We know today it's a difficult day with the rain and the traffic in Lisbon as always. So 5 minutes stops and we will start, okay? Thank you. Okay. I think we are ready to go. So first of all, my name is Rita Faden. I'm FLAD's president. FLAD it means Luso-American Development Foundation. It's a private Portuguese foundation whose role is to bring together Portugal and the United States. And so in this sense, we initiated a cycle that we are very enthusiastic about, which is Meet the Author, where FLAD will bring to Lisbon each month an American author. We started last month with Colson Whitehead, and now we have Joshua Yaffa, and we are very thankful for you being here and very interested for this conversation. So from my part, welcome to FLAD, and let's go to the conversation. Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah. Boa tarde, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here with Joshua Yaffa, and thank you, Rita. I asked Joshua first to read a little excerpt of his book, Between Two Fires. The edition in Portuguese is here, Entre, Dois, Fogos. And Joshua, please.
Sure.
I give you my e-book.
Thanks, first of all, to Rita and Isabel for having me. It's FLAD. Very happy to be here, and delighted to see the book in Portuguese, which I haven't before, and excited to get to talk about it and all things Russia and Ukraine with a new audience. So thank you for coming. The excerpt I'm going to read comes from the opening of the book and describes what I guess you could call the animating idea or prism of the book. What first got me interested in writing the book, at least the way I did, and it's the notion of the wily man, and I'll describe what that means and how it's defined, but it's an idea that was first coined by a Russian sociologist named Yuri Levada. He really was the father of sociology in the Soviet Union, and created, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a center that I'm guessing in our talk I'll be referring to because it is the only independent sociological and polling research institute in Russia today, and does a lot of great work. And in trying to understand Russian society, one inevitably ends up quoting the Levada Center. But here I'm describing an essay called The Wily Man that Levada wrote in the year 2000, interestingly, coincidentally or not, the year that Putin took over the presidency. And it describes Levada's own search for understanding what happened to the Russian person that he had studied since the 1960s, the Soviet person, and why certain habits of mind and habits of action proved more durable than Levada had initially thought and frankly hoped. He was an optimist at the collapse of the Soviet Union, thinking that when the system disappeared, so would this archetype, Homo Sovieticus, as Levada and others called it, would also disappear. But it turned out that this personality type was much more durable than even the system that created it. And so in 2000, Levada sat down to write this essay and work through his thoughts. The Russian wily man, Levada wrote, not only tolerates deception, but is willing to be deceived, and even requires self-deception for the sake of his own self-preservation. Levada saw him as an ultimately clever and resourceful creature. He adapts to social reality, looking for oversights and gaps in the ruling system, looking to use the rules of the game for his own interest. But at the same time, and no less important, he is constantly trying to circumvent those very same rules. I'll skip a bit further in the opening section just to read a bit about how I, having been inspired or educated by that idea of the wily man, began to look at the Russia around me. I moved to Moscow in 2012, and at first was confounded by certain modes of adaptation, compromise, coexistence that so many people I saw in society around me had with a state that they didn't necessarily support, even respect, but nonetheless found themselves somehow compelled to make compromises with and cooperate with. And the wily man prism was very instructive for me and helped me make sense of the world around me. I'll read a bit more about my own use of the wily man prism in understanding Putin-era Russia. For a while, the most fashionable job in Moscow was working on state-funded urban beautification projects, expanding pedestrian zones, renovating city parks, launching bike-sharing programs, rethinking public transport routes. Such initiatives made the city undeniably more pleasant and humane. With time, similar efforts expanded to other cities around the country. Even in the absence of larger democratic reforms, if anything, Russia's politics tacked in an opposite, unmistakably regressive direction. Its cities became more desirable, attractive, and enjoyable places to live. A debate emerged among my friends in Moscow. Is it laudable to lend one's talents and expertise to the state so as to achieve real change on a local level? Or does this only help perpetuate an unjust and inefficient system? The question was never really settled, but surfaced time and again, a referendum on the permissibility of compromise that repeated at regular intervals. Does harnessing the resources and power of institutions you ultimately consider malevolent to achieve something good mean the joke is on them or you? Although the Gulag is a mostly unhelpful metaphor for understanding Putin's Russia, I found myself returning to one thing that Solzhenitsyn wrote about from the camps. If you're stuck inside an unjust system, isn't cheating it a bit here and there for your own purposes an entirely rational, even virtuous response? Maybe there are no good answers to these questions, an impossibility captured in the Russian saying, между двух огней, between two fires, the condition of being stuck in the middle of two opposing forces bigger than yourself. Making it out the other side is just about the best outcome available.
Thank you, Joshua. Now I'm just going to do a small presentation of Joshua and Joshua's work. When we spoke last Friday, Joshua was driving across the border between Ukraine and Poland. And he was leaving the country after 3 weeks writing for the New Yorker. Yeah. The latest article published on this October 17 was entitled "Inside the US Effort to Arm Ukraine," and explained how the Biden administration had provided arms and information to the Ukrainian army since the beginning of the Russian invasion, and how this can be risky in the battle against Putin. Earlier, in another article, he asserted that Putin's escalation in Ukraine was a losing battle and explained why. Joshua Yaffa has been reporting on the war in Ukraine since the beginning in Friday of this year. Before that, for 10 years, he was a correspondent in Moscow for several magazines, the most recent of which was The New Yorker, is The New Yorker. In the book he published in 2020, Between Two Fires, he said he was far from suspecting how a youthful passion for Russian had led him to this path. Born in San Diego, California, Joshua Yaffa holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, and a master's degree in journalism and international affairs from Columbia University, where he was a visiting scholar at the Harriman Institute and taught journalism school for several years. As a journalist, besides of New Yorker, he has written for The Economist, New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, Bloomberg, Business Week, The New Republic, and Foreign Affairs. For his work in Russia, he has been named a fellow at New America, a recipient of the American Academy's Berlin Prize, and a finalist for the Livingston Award. He holds, I already said that. Now we are here to talk about this book, Between Two Fires, and the subtitle is Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Russians but Putin. To make this universe better known, Yaffa has chosen some figures who spent a large part of their lives and careers in a gray zone, in an intermediate, obscure, and complicated world which was never easy to cross, but at least allowed for some maneuvers. As he writes in a life in so-called gray zone. Notable among them are the famous director and filmmaker Serebrennikov, I'm sorry for my Russian, and the director of the information channel Konstantin Ernst. Joshua Yaffa's book won the Oral Prize in 2021 and had the acclaim of many experts in that part of the world. One of those was Anne Applebaum, who called it a study of compromise, opportunism, and the delicate moral dilemmas existing in Putin's Russia. When he wrote it, Yaffa could not have guessed that we were talking today about a war born the unbridled ambition of a man who, as Yaffa argues, has forested apathy in the population as a mean of exerting ever more power over them. Joshua, it's very nice to have you here, as I said before. But before we talk about the book, I'd like you to tell us how the Ukrainians felt after how do you find Ukrainians after 9 months of war? You just came from there.
hard to encapsulate in one word. Big country with lots of people and, of course, lots of opinions, so it would be incorrect to say that there's one attitude. There is a lot of exhaustion. There is a lot of, certainly, sorrow. There's a lot of fear. But what I've been struck by across the country, and this cuts across geography, age, any other ways we might divide or categorize society, a resolve to win. And however kind of banal or cliche that sounds, it's really true in that the most unifying attitude I've found among Ukrainians now, but really going back to February, is that there is no other choice for Ukraine other than to win. And by winning, that means effectively defeating Russia in the military contest, not achieving something through negotiations, not calling for a ceasefire, but winning the war as such. And I've been struck at how that attitude in some ways has only intensified as the war has gone on, even as it's become more costly for Ukraine, as Ukrainians continue to die every day. That only seems to have intensified this certainty.
What the mood of these people could tell us about the overcome of this conflict?
For better or worse, the will and motivation of Ukrainians, their bravery is certainly an important part of, well, certainly how the war has gotten to the stage that it has gotten to, why Ukraine didn't, or rather why Kiev didn't fall in 72 hours as Putin seems to have planned, and as many Western governments also calculated that it would take a matter of days for Russia to take over the country. The reason that didn't happen is in large measure a testament to this unified sense of purpose and bravery and will. But that's only one factor among many. Another factor is, you mentioned the article, most recent article I wrote for The New Yorker, the degree to which Western governments, the United States first and foremost, but not only, will continue to support Ukraine militarily, how far Putin is willing to go to prevent the kind of defeat that Ukrainians are intent on delivering him. But it's clear that at this moment, things could change, things have changed, but at this moment, I don't see Ukrainian society, this is not about Zelensky or other leaders, but Ukrainian society agreeing to anything other than the unambiguous defeat of Russia.
Your book helps us to understand a little more about what Russia is, or what Russia was until the beginning of this war. And your experience in Ukraine in these months changed the way that you look at Russia and Russians now.
Sure.
In which way?
Russia is a place that I wrote about, but it's also a place I lived. It's a place I feel attached to personally. And I couldn't help but feel disappointed, betrayed. It's not really about me, but that I was under no illusion about what Russian society was capable of. But I certainly didn't see the war coming. And the degree to which Russian society responded to the war by trying to ignore it at first was disappointing.
Can you explain more?
Yeah. The wily man tendency that I wrote about in the book and read about, in some sense, should have predicted exactly this kind of response, this avoidance of responsibility, this avoidance of action, trying to pretend as if the war wasn't, not that war wasn't happening, but that the war wasn't something that sort of wasn't the concern of the Russian individual, because the Russian individual has been conditioned to be most comfortable or most habituated in a state of apathy, political disengagement, to see him or herself as not a political agent or subject.
Yes.
And the response to the war, rather than to have that condition be somehow, to have the Russian person be sort of shocked out of that condition and to have that be revealed as somehow, let's say, insufficient or being in some measure what allowed this disaster to happen, by and large, the Russian people sort of doubled down on this wiliness and looked away from the war and certainly looked away from their own personal involvement or responsibility. Another question is, where does that personal responsibility lie? This was not a war that the Russian people wanted. There was no sizable pro-war lobby or movement in Russia in December and January. This war really is a manifestation of the obsessions of one man. So there are interesting and these gray zone questions of the kind that I like when we try to understand what is therefore the responsibility of average Russians. But getting back to the question, and I'm answering here less as a journalist than as someone with an attachment and fondness and affection for Russia, that this habitual or instinctual retreat to wiliness in the face of the invasion was something that nonetheless personally disappointed me.
And you mentioned that disappointment. You referred also to the surprise or eventual surprise of this conflict. But in the conversation that we had last week, you underlined a thing, the suffering. You confessed yourself very shocked and with what you found in Ukraine. That suffering, we assisted on the beginning of the war. The televisions were there. All the televisions in the world were there. Now we can only read, but what we can read, it's almost the negotiations and the crisis that the war is the world crisis of that war. Can you tell us about what is happening now with that people that stayed in Ukraine?
Until very recently, the war was something that had a kind of geographic, like the war in 2014 in the Donbass, Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, which very immediately, just by definition, was geographically constrained. And I remember in those days going to report in Donbass and then coming back to Kiev and having a totally nice life. And something like that almost became possible in the summer of this year. Before I was in Ukraine just now, I was last in Ukraine in June. And Kiev was, as I remember it, people were out on the streets, cafes were open, you could have a nice time, and unless you kind of forced yourself to remember, it didn't feel necessarily like a country at war. And that was true even when I returned in September. But of course, it's a different feeling now with the return of missile attacks, and actually of a kind that never even happened in February and March. The center of Kiev was not under attack the way it is now. And just the other day, and maybe the first time that someone I know, outside of a military situation, outside of someone actually engaged in the fighting directly, but someone I know loosely was killed. The point is not the degree of my association with the person. The point is just that made the war feel...
you made a tweet with
yes, different for me. It was a young woman, 32 years old, who worked as a sommelier at a wine shop in Kiev, and I liked the wine shop a lot, and would go anytime I was in Kiev, and a few times she helped me select a bottle of wine, Victoria, and she was killed at her home. She was 6 months pregnant, and she was killed with her husband in their apartment when a Iranian-supplied drone that Russia has now been using to strike Kiev and other cities hit her apartment building. And that death for me was, as I've said, the first time that, without overstating the degree of our intimacy, I mean, I had seen her 2 times in a wine shop, but nonetheless, it was not a reminder, it was a demonstration that, in fact, the war, I'm scared of the new phase we're in, right? But that this sort of tragedy is something that will no longer be at a remove, but something that becomes more and more personal.
Mm-hmm. Your work in that part of the world and all the work that you did until now, it was only possible because you speak Russian. You are an American. How came that passion? How did you decide? Why did you decide to learn Russian?
Yeah, there's a Russian expression that the appetite grows with the eating, and I think that was my story with Russian. It was what began as an entirely accidental pursuit. Mm-hmm. In college, I had to study a foreign language. I'd studied Spanish in high school.
You are from San Diego, so
that's
it's
right.
Very...
Yeah. So a lot of it was Spanish in the air.
Yeah.
And when I got to college, I thought that would be boring to continue to study Spanish. Why not use this opportunity to do something a bit more unconventional, let's say. So I began to study Russian, but not thinking that would be the center of my academic, let alone professional life. But the more I got into it, and then really the turning point for me was after 2 years already of studying Russian, before I ever went to Russia. I studied in St. Petersburg and lived with a family in St. Petersburg, and that was really, I don't know, love at first sight, obsession at first sight, but I found something immediately so intriguing and fascinating about the place, and I knew, without being able to articulate or imagine all the twists and turns that my life would take, but I knew that this place would have to occupy a larger part of my life than maybe I initially had wagered.
Mm-hmm. Can you read Dostoevsky in Russia?
Not voluntarily. No, I can.
It's a kind of wish of all the people that wants to
Yeah,
read.
yeah. No, my teachers in university, I'm sure, wish I had done more of that. No, I mean, perhaps it's the case in any foreign language I can speak now, basically fluently. I can read when necessary for work, but don't really do it for pleasure, and write under duress, I guess.
Okay. Going to the book and trying a dialogue with this more recent experience. In the time, in a recent conversation that you mentioned, you speak of a kind of pact breaking starting on the 23rd of September, when Putin announced the mobilization. It was an unwritten but implicit pact until now. Would you like to describe what that pact consisted of?
Sure.
And why it is dangerous now for Putin?
I mean, this kind of pact that I'll explain in a second was the context or architecture that allowed someone like the wily man to exist and thrive. And it's a very postmodern pact, and I think this gets at the key difference between Putin's Russia and the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Soviet Union, at least outwardly, professed ownership of a utopian truth, a superior truth, and again, at least on the surface, demanded that people acknowledge and themselves propagate this utopian truth, the superiority of communism, and so on. Mm-hmm. Putin's Russia is very different. It makes no claim on its superiority. Its main argument is not that Putin's Russia offers a better path or better system than others, but simply that all systems are equally flawed, that corruption, inefficiency, cynicism is found everywhere, and that, if anything, the Putin system is more honest, but makes no claim at offering virtues that other systems don't. The point instead is to convince the citizen, as I just mentioned, that there's no better alternative out there, whether it's Denmark, Navalny, it doesn't matter. There's no alternative that can offer a better path, so you might as well make do with this one, but really that the citizen should be entirely disengaged, as I've talked about before, passive, apathetic, and that all the Putin system requires, unlike the communist one before it, is that the individual essentially goes along with this postmodern play acting of loyalty or obedience. Nothing is really required then to simply do nothing. You don't need to do anything in support of the system. The main thing is you don't do anything against the system, but just basically don't do anything. Be passive, apathetic, disengaged, manage your own life, your own concerns, everything concerning politics, geopolitics even more, not your realm, not your concern. We've got this. You take care of your small business and stay out of ours. And in exchange, we won't interfere in your small business. You don't interfere in our running of state, and we don't interfere in your own life, career, as long as you stay out of politics. This is the nature of the exchange, and this worked fairly well for the better part of 20 years. The Putin system didn't begin to be more repressive and therefore intrusive in people's lives just on February 24th when the war began, or just on September 21st when Putin announced the draft. This was a tendency that was happening for years. The state was pushing further and further into people's lives. The state was the one that began to violate this pact, not the people.
Yes.
As the Putin system became more geriatric, let's say, it became less nimble, less clever. Much of what I write about in the book, actually, is a slightly earlier version of Putinism, and it was much more savvy, flexible, nimble, and did a better job of understanding how to play with society, how to co-opt society. One character from the book you mentioned,
Yes.
this director, Kirill Serebnikov, one of the premier avant-garde film and theater directors, not just in Russia, but arguably Europe.
Yep.
For a while, the Putin state was itself interested in at least being seen to be proximate to experimental avant-garde art forms. It was somehow profitable, as the Kremlin understood it, to have this image as well. And so it celebrated Serebnikov. It gave him lots of money for his film and theater productions. It named him the head of a state theater in Moscow. That era ended long before the war. That era ended sort of post even already the annexation of Crimea, but getting toward 2018, 2019, when the state no longer had the interest or even flexibility in being able to be, on the one hand, repressive, and on the other, supporting avant-garde art. It lost this touch for how to do both, and essentially became more and more exclusively repressive. That brings us all the way now to the moment we're in. And I think in understanding how the state violated, perhaps once and for all, this mutual non-interference pact came not on February 24th with the invasion of Ukraine, but on September 21st when Putin announced...
I said 23, but 23rd, but
well, your date may be better.
No.
I don't remember exactly myself. But with the announcement of the military draft, and there's a saying that I think is very true that I've heard both among Russians and among Ukrainians, that Russians only understood what happened on February 24th on September 21st. That was the only. It took 6 months for this awareness to hit them when it became not something that they could externalize, as I talked about in an earlier answer, but something very personal to them, because there are now hundreds of thousands of Russians being pulled off the streets from their homes, from their places of work, and being sent essentially well, in many cases to die in Ukraine for an idea that was never even properly explained to them. A separate issue is how the Putin state is carrying out a military mobilization without having carried out a proper political mobilization, right? Society is not prepared, as one political philosopher in Russia who's quite horrified by what is happening told me, for the military mobilization to be successful, you'd actually have to see something like real fascism, which we're not seeing, right? The Putin state doesn't quite have the courage, I think. It knows that the war is a hard sell, and doesn't have the certainty, I think, of its mission to go for a full political mobilization. So that means that people are being mobilized militarily without even understanding
What's going on?
what's going on. But we're getting now to the sort of culminating point of my answer. Sorry for the discursive path along the way. But the draft is, I think, once and for all, cancels this non-interference pact. What is more interfering than demanding that you go fight and die in a war that was never explained to you? I mean, there's nothing more intrusive to your personal space and safety than being pulled off the street and forced to put on a uniform and grab a Kalashnikov and go die somewhere in Ukraine for a cause that you never had explained to you and certainly don't believe in. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what comes after the disappearance of this non-interference pact, and that also was the fertile soil in which the wily man could exist.
Yeah.
I think both of those phenomenon are coming to an end, at least in the form they have existed for 20 years. But I don't have a prediction as to what replaces them.
It's a new phase.
Yes.
But the man that comes after the wily man, it's unknown yet. I'm asking you.
Yes, because we don't know what kind of Russia will emerge. Russia now is in a liminal phase. This phase can't last for very long. And this is all a dilemma or crisis of Putin's own making. 2 years ago, when there were last large protests in Russia, Alexei Navalny, the main premier protest leader, opposition leader, had been poisoned, nearly killed, came back to Russia, was arrested, and this kicked off a series of protests that the Kremlin put down very forcefully. And I was a quite confident pessimist about the chances of protests or any political change happening anytime soon in Russia. It looked like the system was quite stable, and that I didn't see any inputs or factors that would lead to its destabilization. Putin has created himself the ingredients for it, the most dramatic destabilization that we've seen in 20 years.
Let's go to the book. You choose characters that help you to portray that Russia, that Putin's Russia for the last 20 years. How did you choose that persons? They live in a kind of gray zone, as you said, but why those people, and who are they?
The idea of a gray zone is important to me, and was important to me as I was imagining the book and populating it with characters. Of course, Putin's Russia is full of, on the one hand, heroic, brave, principled dissidents, opposition figures, or simply victims, people who have suffered unambiguously from the regime. At the same time, there are true sadists, there are true dictators, large and small, Putin and many people beneath him in the chain of command. In other words, this paradigm of Stalin, Solzhenitsyn exists. I don't mean to suggest that that's not true, but that wasn't what interested me personally. And frankly, the pleasure, I guess, of writing a book is that you can write about whatever interests you. You have the authorial privilege of picking a theme and characters that, if you're going to be stuck with them for 2 or 3 years, you might as well pick wisely in terms of what will keep you interested throughout this long slog.
Yeah.
And for me, that meant finding people who existed in this in-between area. But also there was a deeper point. It wasn't just that was somehow idiosyncratically interesting to me. It was also that I believed that explains something true about Russian society, about Russian life, Russian existence, that wasn't necessarily coming through in other coverage of Russia, including in my own, which tended to fall in that paradigm of the oppressed versus the oppressor. What horrible thing is the Putin state doing? Those are all true stories that deserve to be told, but I thought that the texture of Russian life wasn't coming through. This idea that I got at, I hope, in the short excerpt I read at the beginning of what Moscow life was like in those days as people navigated questions of, do they go work for the city government to renovate a park when they actually find the overall government abhorrent, and the city government, of course, is part and very much obedient to the federal government. Is that wrong? Is that right? Is it better to make the park better for your fellow citizens, but does that actually only lead to the longevity of an overall system that you find distasteful? The dilemma I talked about or wrote about in the passage I read, that's what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about people who were stuck in between, who started out with virtuous, recognizable ambitions. That was another factor for me. I wanted the characters to be legible to people like you and me. I wanted to de-otherize Russia, demystify it, to present it as a place full of people and stories and dilemmas that are understandable to you and I. And because I think in this Stalin-Solzhenitsyn dichotomy, I'm neither. I don't know about you, right? But I'm hopefully not as cruel and authoritarian as Stalin, but I'm also not as brave and willing to sacrifice my own comfort, safety, and well-being as Solzhenitsyn. So I wanted to find characters who were recognizable to me, who were recognizable to readers, and who had to navigate this complicated world of what do they do with their ambitions, the ambitions that, again, you and I would find understandable and commendable, but in Putin's Russia, oftentimes the only path toward realizing those ambitions is to do it in some sort of relationship with a state that you otherwise find distasteful. And so you have to make compromises along the way. Like Serebnikov, who, it's fair to say, then and now, both as a matter of kind of aesthetic preference, but also politics, morality, has very little in common with the Putin system.
But I would like you to speak about the other character, the director of the channel.
Sure. Konstantin Ernst, the director of Channel 1, a very fascinating person for me personally, but very different, takes on a very different cast in my mind after the beginning of the war, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I first, I guess, have to, before I can explain what I think of him now, I have to explain my long, twisted personal history with him. I wrote about him first in 2014 on the eve of the Winter Olympics in Sochi, when he was put in charge of the opening ceremonies of the Winter Games. And it's really actually a wonderful historical document that's been forgotten, artifact. I encourage anyone who's interested in Russia to go back and watch the opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games. It's really a kind of lost Russia that will both fill you with a kind of nostalgic joy, but also sadness that such a Russia never came into being. But it's a celebration of everything that we can fairly appreciate and love about Russia. It's a really proud and joyous spectacle that Ernst created, and one that he did with real quality. That's the thing about Ernst. He has an aesthetic sensibility and skill as a producer and a director to really rival that of many top professionals in the West. Unlike other propagandists in Putin's Russia who don't have this skill, who aren't as sensitive, creative minds, he really is an auteur, I think. That's how he began his career during Perestroika in the 80s, going on Soviet television with long hair, a black motorcycle jacket, hosting programs about German art house film. I mean, it really must have been a strange thing to see on Soviet television in 1987. You turn on your TV and there's a guy with long hair telling you about Fassbinder movies. But that was Ernst. But he also is a man who believes in the state, who believes in Putin, and who believes in power, his own power, seduced by power, seduced by the ability to reach millions of people. That I think was his goal. Understandable, right? Here we're still in the realm, if we speak abstractly, of things that are common in the West. If someone has the gift and talent of creative skill. There's nothing strange about them wanting to use that skill to reach a wide audience. If you believe that you're a talented television producer, don't you want to make films for HBO or Netflix or what have you? Sure. But the circumstances of Ernst's life meant that the outlet he had was a place like Channel One, which increasingly in the Putin era became an unambiguous propaganda mouthpiece. And the compromise, to the extent it existed for Ernst, was that he wielded his channel very much as an instrument of propaganda. Anything concerning politics, matters of state, Putin personally, Channel One was a place that transmitted without deviation the party line. But Channel One was also a place where after the news, you might see all, 3, 5 seasons of the American television series Fargo aired in translation. On his own birthday, his 60th birthday, Ernst played this, trick or gave himself a present. In prime time, he aired a documentary about Hunter S. Thompson. Sort of weird stuff for thinking about Channel One. This is the main state channel in Russia, viewed everywhere from Smolensk to Vladivostok. And at prime time, without explanation, there's a Hunter S. Thompson documentary. While he also produced entertainment programs that were of a Western quality in many regards. And so he had this duality to his persona that I found interesting and that I thought fit my paradigm. And I had many conversations with Ernst, exploring with him both sides of his personality, coming to the conclusion that there was actually little compromise in Ernst's mind. He's one of the characters in the book who I think was in least conflict with himself. I think that I came to understand or believe that he is a true statist, that for him the Russian state itself is something holy and sacrosanct. And he also believes in Putin's mission. This is Ernst's vision of it, right? Not necessarily my own, but that Putin was someone sent on a historic mission to restore the power of the Russian state, right? That the 90s were this fallen period, a period of chaos, a period of weakness for the Russian state, first and foremost, and that Putin restored order, coherence, functionality, power to the Russian state, and that Ernst was very grateful for this mission. Nonetheless, reserving himself these private spaces or niches for him to act out his interests as an auteur and someone of creative sophistication. And I found something, as I've said, interesting and maybe even a little sympathetic in Ernst. After February 24th, my opinion of Channel One and Ernst is very different. As the space in Russia for these kind of small niches of quasi-freedom has shrunk to almost zero, that's also been the case on Channel One. For the first months of the war, Channel One, in fact, canceled all entertainment programming, became a 24-hour news and information channel, which actually meant being a 24-hour mouthpiece for warmongering. And Ernst did this, I don't know, enthusiastically or not, it doesn't matter. He did it willingly. He did it, is the thing that matters, is that Channel One served the interests of justifying the war and continues to provide the propaganda backdrop, the propaganda context for convincing at first, or trying to convince Russians of the necessity or virtue of this war, and now trying to convince Russians of the necessity and virtue of going to fight and die in this war. And that makes Ernst a much less ambiguous, he's become much more unambiguous in my own mind. This gray zone that he occupied, and maybe it was questionable all along how much of a gray zone there really was, but now it's really disappeared, and I'm not so much interested in Ernst. He's become the sort of character that I described early on in my answer that I wasn't interested in.
Yes.
I no longer find him fascinating. He's made his choice. It's clear what function he serves in the Putin system. There doesn't seem to be internal dissonance. He's not interesting to me anymore.
He's no more in the gray zone.
Right.
On the gray zone. One of the things that you do here in a book, it's a kind of dialogue that you have with literature, and you mentioned the writer Sergei Dovlatov as the best chronicle of the period between the post-Soviet and the 90s. Early, you spoke also about Turgenev, especially with Fathers and Sons, when you described the December Revolution. I ask you if there is a writer for this time now.
Not one that immediately comes to mind. The sad part, I mean, there are tragedies much larger than this, but in losing Dovlatov, who is my favorite Russian writer, maybe of any age, I recommend to those who aren't familiar with his work.
It's published here in Portugal.
Right. Yeah,
Yes.
I read it in both English and Russian. He's one of the few authors, thankfully, who's a much less tortured writer than Dostoevsky. He's just about the only Russian writer I can read for pleasure in Russian, but I've also read him in English,
yes.
and reading in translation, you get many of the same pleasures, so I encourage people to look out
And
for
he
his
wrote
work.
a lot in America.
Yes.
He lived
Yes.
there. So yes.
But losing Dovlatov as a chronicler of Russia exemplifies the larger tragedy, and I'll try and explain what I mean. What made Dovlatov so appropriate for Putin's Russia up until the war is that he so skillfully and hilariously called out this world of make-believe and pretend that the late Soviet Union had become, this world of doublethink in which everyone knew the system was rotten, nobody believed in communism, people had become entirely cynical and looked for outlets in humor, in vodka, in trying to disobey or outsmart their bosses. It was a tragicomic world, equal parts tragedy, but also equal parts comedy.
And absurd also.
Yes, and absurd. But in a way, the stakes were low. People, by that point, the Gulag was closed. Yes, there were political prisoners, but you really had to try to become a political prisoner by the 1980s. I mean, I don't mean to negate or deny that history, but for most people, that wasn't a reality that really threatened them. They could get by in a crumbling, dysfunctional system by, as I said, making jokes to themselves, trying to cheat the state, stealing some spare parts from work to try and fix up your dacha. The state left you alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that world was really resonant to the one that I found in Putin's Russia when I was working on the book. Also this world of make-believe, as I've described, this postmodern world where not much was required of you other than to go through the motions of outwardly at least pretending to be loyal to the system. And besides that, you could sort of do what you wanted. And plenty of people, in fact, the way that most people navigated their lives was to, on the one hand, express this formal de facto outward loyalty while actually harboring all sorts of doubts about the system, sitting around your kitchen, cursing the many inefficiencies and failings of the system, looking to cheat it, to outsmart it, a very Dovlatov world. But the war takes away, certainly the comedy. I find there's not so much funny happening in Russian society anymore. It's not funny anymore. And it's also not absurd. It's much too real and tragic to pertain to the world of absurdity, surrealism, postmodern. This is something much more real than the world that Dovlatov inhabited and the world, in many regards, that I describe in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, or at least I haven't come across a writer who, I think what we need, maybe it's my taste as a journalist, but we need a unsparing, visceral realist to describe the horror and tragedy and trauma of this moment in Russia and Ukraine. Some people point to the writings in a completely opposite end of the spectrum. Sorokin, the Russian surrealist writer, who describes in several of his books these frightening future realities for Russia that there are some scary overlaps with, but again, that world, it's almost too convenient to retreat to the world of surrealist fantasy when reality is so horrible.
And the new generation, the generation that born and raised with Putin in the power, how do you describe this new youngest people?
You're right. There is an entire generation of not even all that young people who
20-something.
Yeah. I mean, 22 if you're going to be literal about born under Putin, but you could go back to 25 or 30, talk about people who, for all intents and purposes, their only personal and political consciousness happened in the Putin age. I write about them in the book, and at the time, I was struck not so much by this generation being anti-Putin. If you actually look at surveys by Levada Center,
Yes.
you find that there isn't a big political divide among generations as concerns attitude towards Putin. And there are understandable reasons for that. Again, this is speaking largely about the pre-war reality. I think this has changed some in the context of the war, and I'll get to that. But pre-war, the Putin system was stable and offered opportunity. If you were ambitious, smart, there were plenty of avenues to try and exercise the talent and ambition. And what was so wrong about the Putin system, especially when you knew no alternative? Mm-hmm. So the younger generation, if you look at the surveys and also if you speak to them, there's nothing determinative about age in in determining political position or attitude toward Putin.
At some point you mentioned that they are conservatives, most of them.
Well, in the sense that they favor the status quo. Mm-hmm. Because if you look objectively, the status quo looked favorable and advantageous to them. What I did find was that they were less wily in the way I describe it, in the sense I use the term in the book and borrow it from Levada. They were less inclined to try and deceive, manipulate, cheat their way, at least through relations with the state. They thought that the state should be more straightforwardly functional and should more straightforwardly deliver on services for the citizenry, and they didn't want their relationship with the state to be defined with these kind of tricks of deception. But nonetheless, they were not revolutionary by any measure. If you do look at the surveys that Levada Center has continued to do since the war, you do have generational breakdown about attitudes towards the war. Younger people are less in favor of the war. What does that mean for actual politics? I mean, there are no politics in Russia. That's the sad state that we've reached even before the war, but certainly the war put a final determinative period, I think, on this question. There is no such thing as politics in Russia today. So what does it mean that certain segments of society have different attitudes about the war or other political events? Effectively nothing, unfortunately. I don't really see that being a break on Putin's ability to continue the war, even as that category is the one that will be the most hard hit, presumably through this mobilization process as they go to fight and die in Ukraine.
As a journalist, what do you fear more in this time?
I've come around to this idea, or maybe it's a feeling more than an idea, but I'm actually much more confident about Ukrainian society and the kind of country that Ukraine is and will be. Whenever this war ends, it will end at some point, I kind of have an idea of the Ukraine that will emerge, that has already emerged in response to this war. It's a country, as I mentioned in the very beginning of my remarks, with a remarkable and very palpable sense of national cohesion, national purpose, a shared vision for general strategic goals, values, orientation, where is the country headed, that is entirely lacking in Russia. Russia is a country that has been for 20 years and is more than ever atomized, completely incoherent, people completely disengaged from a collective project, entirely focused on the individual, no shared sense of purpose, identity, let alone unifying morals or values. They simply don't exist. And I just don't know what that means for Russia, Russian society, the Russian people when this war ends. There are just many more questions for me about what happens in Russia than in Ukraine, where, again, as I said, I feel like I already see the contours of how that country has responded and will respond to the war. In Russia, I have only questions, and I'm afraid that many of the answers to those questions lead to rather scary places.
Mm-hmm. Now we open to your questions. Please.
I'm a colleague of yours, worked many years in Europe as a journalist. I'm puzzled by your analysis about the gray zone and bringing that up to date. Due to the diaspora of hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Russians who have decided to vote with their feet and leave the country. And I think that the wily man perhaps is on the way to become something of the past, because these people have voted with their feet and gone to Turkey, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Yerevan, Armenia, etc. And they voted with their feet and they've made a decision. They've taken only their bare belongings and they've gone there. So this is a break with the wily man, because you've had to put your life on the line. And you're not going to fake it anymore when you are in the street or in your job. So what does that tell you, one, about this new type of Russian and this diaspora, and two, why did Putin allow it on that? We've read stories about how he did allow it because he relies on the urban intellectual, whatever, young professionals, etc. But he's losing the whole generation of these people who can make the Russia great again.
I'm glad you asked the question, because I realized maybe I wasn't as clear as I would have liked in my opening remarks in explaining that indeed the archetype of the wily man I don't think is quite finished, but certainly the war has made that kind of wily existence much more complicated, if not impossible. It has shrunk that space in which you could be a bit of both, in which you could pretend, or at least not outwardly oppose the system while privately extracting benefit from it, that gray zone has shrunk in many cases to almost zero. It's become impossible to do both. You really have to choose, are you all the way in or are you all the way out? Absolutely. And this new era we're in may indeed be the death knell of the wily man character that I described. And whether it's people like Ernst, who, in my estimation, have chosen to go all the way in, or people like the hundreds of thousands of people like those you described, who have found those sorts of compromises no longer tolerable, because in many cases, the biggest outflux, of course, was not connected to, let's say, political ideology or morality, but to the mobilization. It was people fleeing the draft, which is understandable, but that's a slightly different question than having an ideological or moral objection to the regime or to the war. But getting back to an earlier answer to one of Isabel's questions, the draft meant that being wily was no longer possible when the cost of obedience was no longer pretending to be loyal, but to actually going to Ukraine and fighting and risk dying. So I do think we have entered a moment in which this wily paradigm has come under incredible pressure and may, in fact, disappear altogether. That said, even when we look at the hundreds of thousands of Russians who have left, there's 140 million Russians, many more have stayed inside Russia, many more have been forced to double down on the kind of wiliness that I describe as they remain in their jobs, have children they can't take out of school, older parents they have to take care of, don't have the money. I mean, leaving is in many cases, a privilege, even for those who feel like they have no other option, or luxury, rather. So many more Russians remain, and now this dilemma or equation of wiliness has become all the more intensified. And so as it's become impossible for many, and they vote with their feet, as you say, to reject the very proposition, many more are trapped in an even more intense and taxing condition of wiliness. As to why Putin allowed that to happen, I think he's a very smart 21st century authoritarian, right? And this gets at another key distinction between Putin's Russia and that of the Soviet Union, which famously had its refuseniks, people who were barred from leaving the country. If what you care about more than anything, especially when you're a dictator, is regime survival, it's not a bad idea to let out the people most opposed to your regime. They only cause you pressure and problems when they're inside and dissatisfied, and all the more when you lock the exits. I mean, nothing is likely to rile people up than trapping those who would like to leave inside. So you let off steam. You let out those who don't want to be there, and you're left, by definition, with a more apathetic population, or those people who are more willing or have no choice to play by the rules of the game, and those who don't want to play by the rules of the game, see yourself out.
I know this is difficult to do, but I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of how many Russians, like, I'd love to hear a number, a percentage, how many of the Russians buy into the narrative that Putin is propagating?
Sure.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of conversations with Russian sociologists, political scientists, political philosophers, people who I've come to trust over the years, and what I'm about to tell you is not scientific. I should say that ahead of time. Even the Levada Center doesn't poll purposely on the question of do you support the war, because that is a question that is impossible to poll on, even by an independent polling center that has the intent of trying to get a true answer in the current environment of repression, fear, when opposing the war can send you to prison for 15 years. The idea that any polling agency, even again one with the best of intentions, can call people up or knock on their doors and ask, do you support the war, and get anything close to a real answer is an impossibility. I mean, the most common response, if you talk to a place like Levada Center, to questions about the war, is refusal to participate. 90 or 95% of people refuse to even answer the question. So what are you even polling when you're left with 5% of people? Presumably anyone who was in the anti-war camp would be in that refuse to participate camp. So that's a long prologue to why the very notion of trying to understand what Russian people think about the war, at least in a quantitative way, is impossible. So all we're left with are smart minds that I have come to trust who give various estimates, which I will now share with you. So what I've heard over and over again is that 10 to 15% of the Russian population is opposed to the war, doesn't like the war, and I'm talking about just privately. I mean, if we're talking about people who actively oppose the war by doing some externally manifested protest action, we're talking about, I don't know, 0.005%. I mean, we'd have to go add many zeros to get the number of people who are actually doing something about their opposition to the war. But I'm talking about private, personal opposition to the war, 10 to 15%. And another 10 to 15% of people who genuinely support the war want Russia to defeat Ukraine, whatever means necessary. We need to bomb Ukrainian infrastructure. We need to, ramp up our attacks. We can't let Ukraine win. We really need to be more aggressive. Russia is on a historical and just mission. Another 10 to 15%. So that leaves 70 to 80% of people in the middle who, up until at least mobilization, tried not to have any opinion about the war at all, really. Tried to ignore the war, tried to disassociate themselves from the war, in some cases act like it wasn't happening, in other cases at least act like it had nothing to do with them. It wasn't their zone of responsibility. And if it's not your zone of responsibility, then the safer thing to do is to have it not be your zone of interest, right? If you don't control it, then you're not interested in it. I'm interested in my private world as narrowly defined as possible. Another very telling Levada Center statistic that I think is more trustworthy, it's a way of kind of polling around the war without asking the one impossible question, is asking, are you following events in Ukraine? And by the end of the summer, over 50% of those polled said no. And I think that is a more telling statistic in understanding the Russian attitude toward the war. Russian responsibility lies in Russian society's responsibility lies in its apathy and disinterest. And that is both what makes the war possible, but that is also the Achilles heel of the Putin system. This learned apathy that the Putin system has propagated very successfully over 22 years means that people are unwilling to do anything against the Putin system, but it also means they're unwilling to do anything in support or defense of the Putin system. And that makes it a very fragile construction. And so far, the Putin system has existed just fine without needing the involvement of the people. It does its own thing and the people exist in another realm. But Putin has created a situation in which he may increasingly need people to actually support, believe, be not kind of demobilized, but mobilized. And it's a big question as to whether or not he can achieve that.
Hi. Can you hear? Yes. I wanted to ask you a question about the relationship between Russia and China in this moment, because I'm a bit confused. Sometimes, I mean, China is apparently against this war, but on the other hand, the Xi Jinping relationship with Putin seems to be close, so it's quite ambiguous, his attitude. I wanted to ask you, what do we have to expect from China from now on? Will China play a significant role in the next phase or phases of this conflict?
A good question that I'm going to disappoint you a bit with the answer, that I'm not an expert in China per se, or at all really. But it seems to me that China knows a good deal when it sees one, and a desperate Russia with no other options is a quite advantageous, if you're China, first and foremost, business partner. China would like Russian energy at a deal, at a discount, and if Russia loses access to European markets, I mean, you don't have to be a very advanced economist to understand the laws of supply and demand, that China will be able to demand and I'm sure receive a discounted price for Russian energy first and foremost. I think that Russia knows this. Russia has been wary of ending up as the junior partner to China for some years, but now it may have no choice. It may be a function of economic necessity. So China, I think, appears to be concerned about the destabilizing nature of the war. There was this meeting between Xi and Putin last month where Putin had to almost apologize for the fact, not so much for the invasion, but the fact that the war was still going on. It seemed, the subtext to me was that there was a kind of arrangement, I don't know how explicit or not, but that Putin got Xi's acquiescence at minimum for the war by promising that it'll be over in 3 days. I'm going to do this quickly. You won't even notice. Don't worry. And after 6 months, Xi started to ask questions about why this is still going on, and it's creating all these disruptions that are not to China's advantage. And I think that that's going to be a problem, because I don't see the war ending anytime soon. And again, without being a specialist in China, it seems like China's tolerance for supporting Russia and the Russian position is going to fade with time, while at the same time always in the waiting to take advantage of Russia's desperate position when it comes to the economic relationship.
Thanks. I would like to go back to the situation inside Russia and how people feel about the war. And I was wondering if you perhaps could comment on the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. Over the last 10, 15 years, Putin and Putinism have become closer friends with the Orthodox Church. I was wondering if this is a moment where a more active engagement of the population is wished for by Putin and his whole power structure. If you could comment on the role of the Orthodox Church, and if you see that there might be a role there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I write a lot about the church in the book. There's a whole chapter about the church, and specifically about this question of how the church entered into its own kind of wily relationship with the Putin state, and that it traded its holy imprimatur for earthly gain, let's say, right, for political and economic advantage, and also being able to expand its reach in society. The church has done very well under Putin, and in exchange, the church, especially the current patriarch Kirill, has been very good to Putin and given him this holy blessing for his political project. And that has become true all the more. Like Ernst, for example, the church and Kirill specifically have doubled down on their allegiance to Putin in the age of war, and Kirill has lended his own spiritual aura, let's say, and the aura of the church to the war, effectively in all but name blessing it as a kind of holy war, or a war with the sanction and approval of the church, even going so far in a sermon that Kirill gave last month after Putin announced mobilization, saying that dying in this war would be a path to heaven, that it was an almost Christian thing to do, to fight and die in this war. That has led to an even further intensification of a split that was already happening in Russian society, that as the church grew closer to the Kremlin, it was also losing its legitimacy and authority among many members of Russian society, not just among liberals or dissidents, opposition people, but there are many people who find something odd or distasteful about the politicization of the church and want a more purely religious or spiritual experience from the church, and were already growing distant from it as the church became more and more a political organ. And that's a process that has only intensified with time. I don't know, how, much depends on, of course, how the war itself ends, but I don't see, just like with the Putin state in its current form, I don't see how the Putin state in its current form survives the war, nor do I see how the church under Kirill survives the war in its current form. I don't see how there can be a post-war Russia in which the church, as it exists today, just continues in the future with no great process of self-examination or reform. The church has made the same kind of wager that Putin has made, which is victory or the abyss. There's no kind of option for the church. Yes, but that's the world we live in.
Hello, Joshua. My name is Teresa. You were talking about your characters living in that gray area, and I thought about words like denial or maybe ingenuity or illusion even. And then I thought, weren't we all living in that gray area, namely Europeans and European leaders? Particularly in Britain, because I used to live there, so when you have spies just poisoning Russians, and when you have the elite just coming off to the subway tracks and mysteriously dying and everything, weren't we all a bit disillusioned about everything? And did Putin pivot, or did he made us just fools?
Of course, I hope I make this clear in the book, and I'm glad I can make it clear here tonight, that there is nothing exclusively Russian about this phenomenon of wiliness, about self-deception, the proclivity to compromise, cynicism. All of that are universal traits found in Western societies, found in the United States, all over the place. I'm afraid that they are becoming even more common and present traits, certainly in our politics, but also in our society. The point of the book, or one of them as I saw it, was on the one hand to explain Russia, but on the other hand was to explain Russia by, as I mentioned I think in an earlier answer, demystifying it, de-otherizing it, by finding a phenomenon or a prism that is recognizable and universal. And I find that there's a certain explanatory power toward using this prism to make sense of Putin's Russia, but that doesn't mean that it remains exclusive to Putin's Russia. No, it's a habit of mind and action that we find all over in our societies, and I hope that the book, among other things, helps people recognize this phenomenon around us, in our co-workers, and our politicians, neighbors, friends, and first and foremost, within us. I certainly am prone to many of the same forms of wiliness that the characters are. I'm the opposite of casting stones, I hope, in the book. It's not a book of judgment, it's a book of understanding.
Having lived in Russia, do you think there is a lack of patriotism there? Because the sense that I get as a Western is that there is still great love and pride for the Soviet Union, but not so much for the nation and the country of Russia itself. And if so, does that help Putin's regime?
You know, the most interesting thing that I didn't mention about this opening ceremonies of the 2014 Olympics that Ernst produced is that it ends, the last thing, it's this grand tour of Russian history. You have, the czars, even medieval Russia. You have the Rostov ball from War and Peace. You even have the revolution, but it ends with Yuri Gagarin's flight to space. I don't want to get the date wrong. Maybe someone can remind me. 1950. No, 60s something. Yeah, well, late 50s, early 60s. Let's say that's the Latin, and then scene. End, because there was no event after that Ernst could find that provided this unifying patriotic feeling that all Russians could relate to. For the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, much too controversial an event, right? Some people think that was a moment of liberation, progress. Others think that was a disaster, a catastrophe. So you can't use that. Well, what else can you use? What else is there in modern Russian history that unites people?
It's a nostalgia for the great empire.
Yeah, but turns out yes. But what is that? Right? How do you manifest that? What's the event? What's the? That I guess gets back to the history of World War II, which is still very much active in Russia. But there is I think, lack, and I mentioned this a few times in different answers, of a unifying national idea. What is Russia? What is its purpose? What is its vision? What are its goals? What is the reason for its existence? What's the Russian idea in a contemporary sense? I don't feel like there is such a thing. That doesn't mean that Russian people aren't patriotic. They very much are. There is a rich history to draw on that offers plenty of reasons for national pride and patriotism. But there isn't a unified, I think, language around that history and a unified vision for what does that patriotism mean for the present. Russia is very much, under Putin, looking to the past society. That's what this war really is all about, right? It's a war to restore a historical order that Putin thinks is the just and correct one. It's more about the past than it is about the future. In Putin's Russia, in a way that is a real tragedy, because I do love Russia and admire its people, the Russian people aren't being offered a narrative about the future. And I think that for any country, that's a real problem.
I'd like to ask you, why do you think that Putin didn't, how far do you think Putin can go on this special operation, and why he didn't declare war?
He didn't declare war, I think, because he can't let go of this idea, on the one hand, that truly Ukrainians are Russians, or our brothers, younger brothers. This idea of the Ukrainian people being one as the Russian people, because the Ukrainian people don't exist, right? That's the implication, that they're really just kind of lost, confused Russians. I think he genuinely believes this, and so he can't bring himself to wage total war on people that he sees as being part of the larger Russian project. The early idea of the war was, however cynical and absurd, Putin believed it, that the Russian army would liberate the Ukrainian people from this cabal of Nazis and free them of Western influence, and they could return to their natural and correct historical home. He still believes this, even 7 months later, with all the evidence to the contrary. This is the great trap that Putin has created for his own, it's his own making, right? We don't need to feel sorry for him, but he can't let go of this trap. And he also understands, consciously or subconsciously, that the war in its true form, a full-on war in which Russia declares war on Ukraine, full mobilization, would be a hard sell at home. The Russian people don't really want it. They're okay with this kind of war on the cheap, American-style war, right? That kind of happens over there. Society doesn't really have to suffer, pay a cost, pay attention, and we get a victory on the cheap. I think he knows that it would be dangerous for him to ask too much of the Russian people. As to how far he's willing to go, at this point, he has created an escalatory spiral in which there is no backing down, especially after the, however transparently absurd annexations of Ukrainian territory in the south and east, declaring the city of Kherson, for example, to be Russia. How can he see the liberation, or I guess it's in the sort of topsy-turvy world of Putin's own creation, the occupation of Russian Kherson by the Ukrainian army? I mean, how can he allow such a thing? His entire reputation and legacy is now at stake. And by, for example, now sending Russians to fight and die in the war, he's also raised the stakes. How can he now back down? How can he explain a loss to the Russian people? So the only way for him is up. And I'm convinced that we will eventually get to the point where the use of nuclear weapons is being threatened in the most explicit and immediate way. I don't know, that will bring us to already such a new and perilous reality. It's hard to predict, will they actually be used or not? Much depends on the response of the West. What happens within the Russian elite, Russian political system when we get to this moment. But we will get to that precipice. Do we go over the edge? I don't know, I hope not, but I don't see any scenario in which we don't end up right at the very absolute last point.
Hi, Joshua. I just wondered, when you were talking about Ernst and the Sochi Olympics, I couldn't help but make comparisons between Nazi Germany, Leni Riefenstahl, the 1936 Olympics, and I just wondered whether you actually wondered about these comparisons in your book.
Of course, the Olympic Games were the parallels were too sort of obvious to ignore, but as concerns that specific event, I don't mean sort of Putinism writ large, but that was in what made it such a welcome event. Even just to don't believe me, believe Navalny, who commented on specifically those opening ceremonies as a feel-good moment for Russia. Navalny was a fan of those opening ceremonies, right? So I mean, if you don't believe me, believe him. That was a unifying event, a rare unifying event for Putin, Russia. But it was essentially positive. It wasn't. There are many other aspects of Putin propaganda that are about instilling either fear, hate, distrust in the other, demonizing the West, demonizing those in Russia who would be seen to be agents of the West. But this was not that. This was a kind of rare, feel-good, positive moment. It was propaganda, but it was not fascist propaganda. The more interesting comparison is what's happening now. And this gets to the point made by this wonderful political philosopher, very smart guy, Greg Yudin, who said to me that, in order for there to be successful in order for there to be successful military mobilization, you need to have political mobilization, you need to see real fascism. And we don't have that. You don't have stadiums full of people burning Ukrainian flags, calling for the death of Ukrainians. There's no mass movement in Russia calling for the death, subjugation of Ukrainians. It doesn't exist. I guess that's a good thing, right? That there doesn't seem to be real fascism in Russia. That may prove a break on what Putin can do in the war. Getting back to the previous question, how far can he go in the war? It may not. But in terms of just categorizing political systems and understanding events, Putin's Russia is not fascist and doesn't have the trappings of fascism. When we speak of a mass movement in society, I think that the apparatus, especially the repressive apparatus of the Putin state, behaves with attributes of a fascist system, absolutely. I'm talking about society writ large, doesn't seem to have entered this fascist fever dream that we saw in the 20th century.
I guess our time is over. There are books outside. One more question? Yeah. Can I?
I'll try to be quick.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, there is a writer and a personal enemy of Putin called Bill Browder. He said that the only way to stop Putin is to go after his oligarchs and basically strip them of money because their money is Putin's money. Do you think this strategy could work, and why hasn't it worked already, in your opinion?
I think it hasn't worked. I'll try to be brief, because it turns out that the Putin system is actually not only about money. If it was only about money, Putin never would have invaded Ukraine. That's the most nonsensical thing to do. If at the end of the day, all you care about is your billions and access to billions in Western bank accounts and the ability to sail your yacht to Italy, you would never invade Ukraine. That's a crazy thing to do. And he did it because he is on, in his own mind, a historical mission. He's compared himself to Peter the Great. Quite interestingly, I think importantly, in understanding the state of mind that Putin is in, and understanding why he embarked on this invasion and what he wants out of the war. Going after the money of the oligarchs may have its own virtue and reason, but it's not going to be the thing that ends the war, because access to money is not the ultimate priority of Putin at this stage.
Thank you so much, Joshua. One more?
Yeah. We'll sorry. We'll make one more and we'll make it quick.
So my question is related to what you were saying now. we've seen...
Can you speak louder, please?
Oh, sure, sorry. So in Europe, we've been seeing lots of instability. If you go to France, you'll see strikes happening every day, almost night, this week at least. You see rising inflation, all records of inflation. You see interest rates keeping up with inflation and increasing as well. So it seems like in Europe, we're funding this war, economically speaking, right? And in Ukraine, you see people dying in order to help the country, save the country. So my question is, who do you think will give up first? Will it be the Europeans, the Westerns? Due to the winter that it's also coming, the price of gas it's higher. Do you think Europeans and the US, mostly Europeans, will give up first, or do you think it will be the Russians that will decide to change the country from within? I know this is the billion-dollar question.
Right. Well, the initial question, as I understood it, was about the durability of willpower in European publics versus Ukrainian publics. There's no question to me at all. I mean, not just as a question of national character or DNA, but simply the war is existential for Ukraine, and Ukrainians in a way it's not for Germans or French. So of course, the odds are you're going to see flagging support and willingness to sacrifice in Europe long before you'll ever see it in Ukraine. That seems obvious. But there's a big question as to what the actual cost of this war will be for Europe. I'm not an expert per se in energy markets. I do live in Berlin, where the German government has announced with great fanfare that it's already, this is even a month ago, that it had already secured 85%, I think, of the energy reserves it needed for the winter. And so the idea of mass energy shortages or huge spikes in prices may not actually happen in Germany. Let's see how Europe gets through the winter. I think that there's a chance that European societies and European individuals see that it's possible to live without Russian gas, that the cost of doing so is not so traumatic or apocalyptic as certainly Russia would hope, and that if this is the case, then it's really a new era, and Russia, Putin has yet again shot himself in the foot. He has forced Europeans to wean themselves off of Russian energy, something that they would not have done for decades if it wasn't for this war. And if they manage to do it, there's no going back from that new reality either. Premature clapping.
Thank you. Do Zelensky's discourses resonate in Russian society, and how is he perceived by them?
I've been very impressed at how Zelensky periodically has made appeals to Russians. His native language is Russian. He spoke Russian at home with his parents, so he's very fluent. He's fluent in Russian, but also as an entertainer, skilled, and he's a good communicator in Russian as well. I don't think that message has penetrated so widely. I know there are Russians who find his appeals compelling, but frankly, those are the kinds of Russians who were against the war to begin with. I was struck by and hopeful in the beginning at Zelensky's attempts to, say, go over the head of Putin or go over the head of Channel 1 and try and speak to Russians directly in Russian. I just haven't seen that having a very large effect that hasn't become a real factor driving events inside Russia itself.
So, we can clap. Can we clap? The books are outside. I guess you are very happy to sign.
With pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.